we're going to go over some of the clinically relevant tracts, ascending and descending tracts, towards the end. Start with the anatomy of the spinal cord. You guys, I'm sure, remember quite well from anatomy, gross anatomy. You have the H-shaped gray matter, which consists of the cellular elements surrounded by the white matter of the spinal cord. This is consistent throughout the spinal cord from the foramen magnum, the hole in the skull, all the way down to its termination in the adult around L2. If you look at a cross-section of the cord, it has different features. On the posterior aspect, it has a posterior median sulcus, versus the ventral side, it has a fissure. So the fissure is much deeper than that small indention on the back as the sulcus. Also on the posterior sulcus, there's an intermediate sulcus. Do you see where it says septum there? One, that's misspelled. Two is that the septum is supposed to be connected here's the sulcus, the intermediate sulcus. The septum is supposed to be connected to that. I couldn't get it to line up on the slide. You see that little dotted line right there? That's supposed to be connected to the intermediate sulcus. This intermediate sulcus continues inferiorly as the intermediate septum. Then you have a lateral sulcus, and on the ventral side you have a ventral sulcus, and those are where the dorsal roots or the ventral roots enter and exit the cord. Okay, so the lateral ones are associated with the dorsal horns, and on the ventral side, they're associated with the ventral horns. Everybody follow that? Amy, you look like you don't believe me.
I believe you.
Okay.
What, me or?
That's good. That's all.
Amy's in here.
Now, one thing you have to remember when we talk about the gray matter, is that it's a column. It's a column of neurons that goes all the way down the cord. It's not just a layer here, a layer here, a layer here. It's a column. So that's how it's represented in this illustration here. It's an entire column of neurons, neuron cell bodies specifically, along with their supporting cells we'll talk about later on. And similarly, when we get out to the white matter, these are axons that are running up and down the cord. And we'll go over the detail of those in a little bit later. Okay, if you have any questions about anything I say, just stop me and I'll try to explain it. Remember the coverage of the cord. The outermost layer of the nervous system is the pia. That outermost layer continues onto the filaments that will make up, or rootlets, however you want to describe them, that continue on to the spinal nerves themselves. So that the outermost covering is the pia. Then you have, above that, you have the arachnoid matter, and then the dura. Of course, in the subarachnoid space, between the arachnoid and the pia is where you're going to find the CSF. The organization of the cord is like this. If we consider the white matter first, and it's named white because it has a high, these axons have a high content of myelin. Myelin appears white in a fresh specimen. So we take the white matter, the stuff around, and we divide it into three funiculi. We have a posterior funiculus, a lateral, and an anterior funiculus. Within each funiculus, there will be different tracts or fasciculi. A fasciculus is like fascicle. It's a bundle of fibers that have a similar function. The funiculus is the large segment, either posterior, lateral, or anterior. Around the gray matter, there is a specific white matter tract. It's called the fasciculus proprius. Fasciculus proprius. Now, if you look at the gray matter, back in the 1950s, this guy named Leroy Rexed, R-E-X-E-D, came up with a numbering system for the different areas of the gray matter. Actually, his name wasn't Leroy. His last name was Rexed. I just made that shit up. So they're numbered Roman numerals 1 through 10. And each of these numbers has a function, has a separate function. You start the numbering in the dorsal horn. So the very tip top of the dorsal horn is lamina 1, Rexed lamina 1. The function of that lamina, the cells, the neurons in that lamina, are basically to connect one level of the cord to the next. There's just an inner neuron. The projections just go to the next level or two. Lamina 2 is called the substantia gelatinosa, like gelatin osa. Substantia gelatinosa. It's not listed up here. Rexed lamina 2 is also called the substantia gelatinosa. When hold your hand out. So if I take a sharp object and I cause pain, that pain information goes into his spinal cord and synapses in lamina 2. So lamina 2 contains the neurons, the relay neurons, for pain and temperature. This is where you're going to love me. Rexed lamina, because I'm not going to name all 10 of these lamina, which is I know what you were like getting really depressed about. You're suicidal. So we're going to say lamina 3 through 6 are relay neurons. You know when we talk about the deep tendon reflex, where you put your hand on the hot stove, that sensory information comes in. And it's pain, at least for the hot stove, right? That's got a synapse and substantia gelatinosa. But if I'm just tapping your knee, that's not painful. That comes back out, so you contract your leg, right? There's an inner neuron that connects the afferent to the efferent. That's, you'll find in lamina 3, 4, 5, 6. Lamina 7 is out here. It's out here. There it is right there. That's the lateral horn. That contains the preganglionics. Remember the preganglionics, the intermediate lateral cell column? That's lamina 7. Lamina 8 is more interneuron. Lamina 9 contains these clumps of neurons that are going to be the motor neurons to the periphery. And lamina 10 is over here around the central canal. And it receives autonomic, it receives sensory input from viscera. It receives sensory input from this. Like the autonomics go out of 7 to your heart, that sensory information from the heart comes back through the dorsal horn and will synapse here in lamina 10. And from 10, it gets relayed up to your unconsciousness. That's the structure of the spinal cord. We're done. Okay? All right, but let's talk about the. Yeah.
Sorry, I got all of them, but I missed one. What do you say about one?
One connects essentially, it's called the lamina propria. It connects one spinal cord level to another. Kind of just a relay. We'll go into that a little bit later on. The vascular supply of the spinal cord comes from a couple of different places. One is, you remember back up in anatomy, we've got the two vertebral arteries. Anteriorly, there's a branch that comes off medially from each vertebral that will join to form the anterior spinal artery. The anterior spinal artery, you see here, supplies a large chunk of the anterior portion of the spinal cord. There's also a posterior spinal artery that comes off of each vertebral artery separately and runs down the cord on the backside, right where the dorsal root is going in. You'll find, like if you were to take a cross section here, here's the dorsal root coming in there. The posterior spinal artery is there on each side. So you have two posterior spinal arteries, one ventral spinal artery. And then as you go down, you get these radicular arteries, they call them segmental arteries here, from the different levels of the aorta. Like as the aorta goes down through the thorax, you give all the intercostals, there will be branches off of those intercostals that make their way back to the spinal cord. They also provide the spinal cord. Now, this anterior spinal artery is kind of the main guy. But, once it gets down to about here, T12 or so, it just sort of peters out. So what we have to do is give it an infusion of blood through this specific artery called the artery of Adamkiewicz, or however you pronounce that word. It is one of these radicular arteries. It's a segmental artery off of the aorta. But it's huge, and it usually occurs only on the left side. It comes from the left. And as you see in this illustration here, they've got the catheter there, they squirt the dye. You see it goes up, and it continues the anterior spinal artery down till its end. So this is the artery that reconstitutes the anterior spinal to supply the lower cord segments. The reason this is important is that you're doing an arteriogram, let's say the kidneys, and you squirt a big chunk of very viscous contrast material in here, and you block that artery because it's sitting right there at the level of the renal arteries, you can wind up with a paraplegic person. That's not a good outcome. Okay? Artery of Adamkiewicz. Anybody speaks Polish or Yiddish or whatever this is? Step on up. Step on up. No? Okay. It's funny that people are shaking their heads. No, I don't speak Yiddish. So anyway. All right, so here are the, this is such a low magnification. You're not going to see these different lamina. You only see that when you get much higher magnification. But you can see these clumps of motor neuron cells representing lamina 9. They come out pretty easily. A couple of things here. Many years ago, this guy came up with a numbering system of the brain. His name was Brodmann, B-R-O-D-M-A-N. I don't know if I've ever told you that. Did I ever tell you that? Brodmann. So he took slides, microscope slides of the different parts of the brain, and came up with about 45 different areas that had the same cytoarchitecture. Turns out many, many decades, maybe a century later, that those areas, like in area 4, all of the area 4 had the same function. So not only was the architecture similar, the function was the same. Area 17 was purely vision. But he didn't know that. He just said they looked the same. He had no idea what they did. They just looked the same. Rexa did the same thing in the 50s. He had no idea what these different segments or these different lamina did. He just knew that the architecture looked the same. Turns out they do have the same function that we just went over. So that's the relevance of this. And one thing you should know about the nervous system is it's incredibly complex. Tomorrow I'm going to tell you about the trillions of neurons and synapses. It'll just blow your mind how many there are. Yet it's pretty doggone well organized in that when you're talking about the motor innervation to the upper extremity, I can tell you it's going to be from here, not there. If I look at your cortex up here and I say that you cannot move your big toe, I can say it's here and not there. It's very well mapped. Okay? So that's one of the points of this slide here, is that the architecture has a similar appearance and function. Okay? Dorsal horn cells are tiny, relatively speaking. Dorsal horn cells are dealing with sensory perception and relay of sensory information. The ventral horn cells are large by comparison. If you look at a ventral horn cell, here's a big motor neuron right here. This is called an alpha motor neuron. This is a neuron that's going to an extrafusal muscle cell. By extrafusal, I mean, you remember earlier today I was talking about Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles? The cells within a muscle spindle are called intrafusal. The muscle itself is outside the muscle spindle. It's called extrafusal. So alpha motor neurons go to extrafusal fibers. They're very characteristic in that they are multipolar. They have numerous dendrites. They have one axon. They will only have one axon. That one axon, where it leaves the cell body or the perikaryon, there's a light staining area. It's called the axon hillock. That's how you can tell which one the axon is, by the presence of the axon hillock. It's also much bigger than the dendrites. Of course, that's the nucleus and a nucleus. These are mitotically active, not mitotically, these are biochemically very active cells because they're constantly having to repair themselves and they're constantly having to transport neurotransmitter from the cell body out to the motor implant. If you're talking about the wiggling your great toe, then that neuron cell body is right here in my ventral horn, and the axon goes all the way down to my foot. So it is a long cell. There's a lot of energy required to maintain that cell. Okay? Well, how do they know, in terms of where things go and what they innervate? And, how do they determine what the architecture of the nervous system is? They actually knew this long before modern day electrophysiology experiments and all sorts of, like the electron microscope and stuff like that. They actually have known this for hundreds of years by looking at lesions and I'm saying it wrong. By looking at a patient, he can't move his left side. So after he died, we cut his brain up and stained it. And there are different types of neurological stains. Some stain the cell body, some stain the axon. This particular one right here stains the axon. And what we found in Uncle Ronnie, who couldn't move his left side, is that you see how this bundle of fibers looks nice and black? And this bundle of fibers over here didn't take up the stain and appears dead. That's how it was known for a long time that the pyramids contained axons that were involved in movement. The right pyramid was degenerated if the left side of the body didn't work, and vice versa. So degeneration studies was one of the ways, one of the mechanisms that they were able to determine function from form. All right, now it's much easier. Okay, so if we look at the white matter tracks, here we go. There are three, the main ascending pathways, and there are a bunch of ascending pathways, but we're going to focus on three. One of them we already talked about is the dorsal column. The dorsal column carries light touch, proprioception, two-point discrimination, vibration, right? That's back here, the dorsal column. The spinothalamic tract, the lateral spinothalamic tract, carries pain and temperature. That's out here. Right there. No, that's right. It's right there. The final pathway is called the spinocerebellar tract, and these are these two blue ones you see right here on the lateral part. Spinocerebellar tract. Good thing about the nervous system is they name a lot of things about where they come from and where they're going to. We know that spinocerebellar is going from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Spinothalamic tract goes from spinal cord to the thalamus, and so on. Dorsal column, we don't really know what that's, well, anyway, never mind. Forget I even said any of that. Okay, let's go back up to the dorsal column for a second. It says right there, gracilis and cuneatus. So here is our dorsal column right here, right? There's the dorsal horn. So the dorsal column is divided into 4 fascicles. The medial 2 are called the gracilis, fasciculus gracilis. The lateral 2 are called the fasciculus cuneatus. So this is the deal. If so what information goes through this pathway again? Touch, 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 touch. So if I'm down here at, beginning at your lower dermatomes, like your feet, for example, and I touch your feet, that touch information comes in the dorsal horn and enters the dorsal column and goes north. It's the same neuron. Where's the cell body of that neuron? Where's the cell body of all sensory neurons? Dorsal root ganglion. Exactly. I touch your big toe, that sensation enters and it goes north. When you get up to T6, so all these axons, they're going to start piling in like this, right? So what did I say your lowest dermatome was this morning? Your anus. If Ronnie touched your anus, it's going to be most medial. As you go laterally, you start going up the dermatomes. So your anus would be here, your butt would be there, your toe would be there, your thigh would be there. You see, you're coming up the dermatomes, right? When you get to T6, right here, T6, that's where you see this septum. So T6 starts piling in here. T5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cervical, cervical, cervical. So it's as if we're talking about a caricature of you onto here, if we were to put your anus right there, and you do this, this is how the sensory nerves are packed in. The gracilis takes care of T6 and below. The cuneatus takes care of T6 and above. So you don't see cuneatus or this septum until you're above T6. So I can look at this section of spinal cord right here. I can say we're above T6 because it's got both gracilis and cuneatus. Okay? No questions about that? Excellent. All right, let's go to the descending tracts. There are 436 descending tracts. Not really? I don't know how many there are, but there are a bunch of them. The main one, though, the main one that you have to worry about, really the only one you have to worry about in terms of testing it, is the lateral corticospinal tract. The lateral corticospinal tract. That is your primary voluntary movement tract. So if I say, Ron, pick up that pen. Everything that comes out of his brain, the descent, where do you think the corticospinal tract comes from and goes to? Cortex to the spine. If I say pick up that pen with his arm, with his upper extremity, you know that this is supplied by the brachial plexus, right, which is C5, 6, 7, 8, T1. He's going to reach for it like that. So what's driving that movement are the neurons in the corticospinal tract. Those neurons from the cortex to the level of the spinal cord, C5, 6, 7, 8, T1, they're called upper motor neurons. In other words, the cortex input to the spinal cord, that's upper motor neuron. The ventral corticospinal tract, let's just don't even worry about. Just strike through that. Let me just explain it since I put it up there. The lateral corticospinal tract is a crossed pathway, as are these sensory pathways. They're crossed. So if you have a lesion of the right cortex, you won't be able to move the left side of your body. The ventral corticospinal tract contains only 10% of the descending fibers of the corticospinal. 90% of them cross. These are uncrossed. They're same side. It's kind of an accessory pathway. Because it's only 10%, let's forget it. But if you're on Jeopardy and they say, what motor pathway from the cortex to the spinal cord remains uncrossed, you would say, oh, that's the anterior spinal cord response. Okay, so, or ventral. All right, now the other two pathways, though, we're going to talk about when we get to the brainstem, really. Rubrospinal tract. Where do you think the rubrospinal tract comes from? It comes from the red nucleus. Right? Rubro. And then vestibulospinal tract comes from the vestibular apparatus. Why would you have an input into the spinal cord from the vestibular apparatus?
Balance.
Not only balance, but what's a Romberg doing? I am telling I know where I am in space, right? Think of this. Your vestibular apparatus, that's what it does. It tells you where your head is in space. It tells you about angular momentum, acceleration, deceleration. But it's also hooked to your eyeballs. Right? There's a relay from the vestibular apparatus to your eyeballs. Why? When I say eyeballs, I mean cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. What did 3, 4, and 6 drive? The extraocular eye movement muscles. What is this pathway related to? Allison is sitting over there. You see that white headband she's got? I'm looking at that white headband. And I'm going to focus on that white headband. I'm going to keep my eyes focused on that white headband. No matter where my head is or my spinal cord is in space. That's the purpose of this tract. Okay? You see how it all makes sense? Neuro is so easy. I'll go over the rubrospinal tract here in just a minute. Levels of the cord. Levels of the cord, we know the spinal cord in the adult stops at L2. So if we look at cross sections of the cord down as you go down, they have different appearances. Much different appearances. The gray matter has a different appearance at different levels, and so does the white matter. The largest area of white matter you're going to see is in the upper cervical cord. Why? Because it's up here where everything has to go down and everything has to come up. It's going to be minimal down here in the lower sacral region, where the only sensory input you have is from your anus and around your perianal area. You don't have that many fibers going up or down. The gray matter, on the other hand, when you look at say the thoracic region here, and you look at the amount of alpha motor neurons that are going to extrafusal fibers, what are the extrafusal fibers you got at T4? The intercostals. That's it. Little thing like that. Intercostals. So the gray matter at the thoracic region is small. The ventral horn gray matter, anyway. And so is the dorsal horn, because you're only dealing with this intercostal dermatome. You get down here where you're dealing with all these muscles in the arm, or upper extremity and lower extremity, the ventral horn is humongous, as is the dorsal horn, because you got a lot of skin where you get that sensory information back in. So the architecture of the gray and white matter changes depending on the level of the cord. If you look at this slide right here, this illustrates it even better. There's the thoracic region right there. I can look at that and say that's a thoracic cord. Wherever the takeoff is to the upper extremity and the takeoff to the lower extremity, they're called the cervical and lumbar enlargements. Because look at all these muscle cells that are going to have to get innervated by these alpha motor neurons. And the sacral down here looks sort of disproportionate because it has so little white matter. If we look at a few cord segments, let's look at this one. Here's the low cervical spinal cord. So C, somewhere, so you got 8 cervicals, so we'll call it C5, 6, 7, or 8. What comes off at C5, 6, 7, or 8? The brachial plexus. You're going to have a big ventral horn. You have a pretty good dorsal horn, and because it's in the cervical area where you have all the ascending and descending fibers, you have a huge amount of white matter. And because it's cervical, it's above T6, we have a prominent cuneatus. There's the septum right there, between the gracilis and cuneatus. If we look at the lower thoracic cord, oh, it's just pitiful, it's just pitiful. The thing, though, that pops out in the lower thoracic cord is the intermediolateral cell column, which you see is the lateral horn right there, containing, this is for the bonus prize, what is in the lateral horn of the thoracic cord? The what? Sympathetic, preganglionic pericardia. Good job, Jordan. Okay. Oh, it says Clark's column here. There's a little explanation here. It's essentially a relay for the spinocerebellar tract. So, the low lumbar, huge ventral horn, giving rise to the alpha motor neurons of the lower extremity. You also have a huge amount of surface area of skin, so you're going to have a large input on the dorsal horns as well. You should be able to recognize these 3 segments pretty easily. Okay. In the sacral area, it says here, you have another lateral horn. What's in that lateral horn? Parasympathetic preganglionics, S2, 3, 4. The reason the ventral horn is so big, S2, 3, 4, keeps the pelvis off the floor. What nerve am I talking about? The pudendal. The pudendal, that's the happy nerve. You should always remember the pudendal nerve. I mean, geez. Without a pudendal nerve, you might as well be like a PA program director or something. All right. Here's another thing I want to talk about. There are a lot of things I want to talk about today. If we look at the ventral horn, there are 2 types of motor cells in there. I talked about the alpha motor neurons. Alpha motor neurons are going to extrafusal fibers. There are also gamma motor neurons. The gamma motor neurons go to the intrafusal fibers. They're smaller neurons than the large alphas. If you look at this illustration here, there's the ventral horn. You've got gamma and alpha going to intrafusal and extrafusal respectively. These things are part of the relay system here. There's the muscle spindle. There are 2 types of cells within a muscle spindle. They're called chain fibers and bag fibers. They're illustrated over here. I think Professor Polk will probably go through some of this stuff when she preaches to you later on. But anyway, the afferent input comes in and comes through interneurons and back out. That's the reflex we talked about this morning. I also mentioned this morning. If we take the segments of spinal cord and start up here in the upper cervical region, that's where you're going to get the shoulder. And you see, as we go down to the fingertips, that's where we get to T1. So if you're doing a neuro exam or musculoskeletal exam, and I'm testing muscle function, just remember this, that when you start dealing with rotator cuff muscles, pectoralis muscles, it's up here in the high cervical region, and as you get down to doing this, now you're down to T1. So if a person can't do this, don't be looking for a lesion up around C4. It's not going to be there. It's around T1. This is a very handy thing to keep, just a framework to keep in mind. You don't have to memorize these different segments, but that descending pathway. Okay. Here, the only reason I have this in here is for one thing. If we look at the alpha motor neurons here, they're also arranged, remember how this is arranged like this? The ventral horn is similarly arranged. The trunk muscles are more midline, and the limbs are more lateral. So if you look at the different clumps of lamina 9, the ones out laterally are going to be going to the limbs versus those that go to the trunk. So why do I make that distinction? I mean, who gives a rat's ass? I mean, if you have, are you really going to have a lesion of the medial parts of the ventral horn? You actually are. There are diseases that involve specific parts of the spinal cord. I'm going to mention one later on. So you have to know if a person comes in with truncal weakness and a loss of certain sensations, that could be a certain disease versus in another area of the nervous system. And that's why I make that point. This right here shows an interesting point. What?
Get the locking.
Oh, it all went out. Oh, okay. I thought it was just that one. Take a break. This is a good point to take a break.